Smarter, Faster, Better, The Secrets of Being Productive in Life and Business by Charles Duhigg. Picture this. It's the middle of the night, 4 hours into what should have been a routine flight from Rio to Paris. Suddenly, the cockpit of Air France Flight 447 erupts with screaming alarms. This wasn't some aging jalopy. This was a state-of-the-art Airbus A330, cruising smoothly on autopilot through a storm. Then, in an instant, tiny ice crystals blocked a few sensors on the plane's exterior. The autopilot, suddenly blind to crucial data, did exactly what its programming demanded. It shut itself off and dumped control back into human hands. Warning bells chimed. A synthetic voice announced, calm as ever, "Stall, stall." Pierre-Cedric Bonin, the junior pilot, grabbed the controls. Here's the wild part. If these three trained pilots had literally done nothing, absolutely nothing at all, the plane would have kept flying just fine. The ice would have melted within seconds, and everyone would have landed safely in Paris. But panic has a funny way of hijacking our instincts. Surrounded by flashing lights and shrieking alarms, Bonin did what felt natural in the moment. He pulled back on the stick, tilting the plane's nose skyward. The aircraft began climbing. Here's the problem. At 35,000 feet, the air is ridiculously thin. Pointing a plane upward in those conditions is like trying to swim with concrete shoes. It disrupts the airflow over the wings, and the plane loses the one thing keeping it aloft: lift. Instead of climbing, it starts falling. "Stall! Stall!" the alarm repeated. The plane was now plummeting at 10,000 feet per minute. The nose pointed up toward heaven, but the aircraft was dropping like a grand piano off a rooftop. Chaos consumed the cockpit. "What the hell is happening?" one pilot gasped. "I don't have control anymore," another screamed. "I don't have control at all." For 4 agonizing minutes and 23 seconds, 3 highly skilled pilots wrestled with a perfectly functional airplane all the way down into the Atlantic Ocean. They had every piece of information they needed glowing on their screens. They had years of training. They had the skills. So what went catastrophically wrong? It wasn't the machinery. It wasn't the weather. What killed Flight 447 was something far more human: a collapse of attention. A breakdown in the simple act of choosing where to look. And here's the uncomfortable truth. This kind of failure happens to all of us every single day. We're just lucky the stakes are usually lower. This is the fascinating territory that Charles Duhigg explores in his eye-opening book, Smarter, Faster, Better. Duhigg, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author of the mega-hit The Power of Habit, tackles a deceptively simple question. Why do some people and organizations accomplish mountains of meaningful work, while others just spin in circles? Why are some folks merely busy, while others are genuinely, effectively productive? The answer, he discovered, has shockingly little to do with grinding longer hours or trying harder. It's all about making a handful of smart choices that most of us completely overlook. This book is your backstage pass to the science of productivity, a guide through 8 game-changing concepts that can revolutionize how you work, think, and live. By the time we're done here, you'll understand why the U.S. Marines deliberately teach fresh recruits to question authority, how Google accidentally built their perfect teams by caring about emotions, and how the brilliant minds behind Disney's Frozen rescued their movie from disaster by leaning into creative panic. This isn't about trendy life hacks or fancy to-do list apps. This is about fundamentally rewiring how your brain approaches challenges. It's about becoming genuinely smarter, faster, and better at everything that matters to you. The road to becoming smarter, faster, and better starts in an unexpected place, deep inside your own mind, wrestling with that stubborn force we all know too well: motivation. You know the feeling. There's a project looming, a deadline breathing down your neck, or just a soul-crushing pile of emails staring at you, and you simply cannot get started. You'd rather organize your sock drawer. It's not a character flaw, though. It's actually a failure of a very specific mental trigger. Duhigg shares a fascinating story about the U.S. Marine Corps. Back in the late 90s, General Charles Krulak noticed something troubling about the fresh-faced recruits arriving at boot camp. These kids had spent their entire lives following instructions from parents, teachers, coaches. They were great at compliance but terrible at initiative. The problem? Modern warfare demanded Marines who could think independently, make split-second decisions in absolute chaos, without waiting for permission from headquarters. They desperately needed to teach internal motivation, so they redesigned boot camp from scratch. They kept the terrifying drill instructors and the bone-crushing marches, naturally, but they added something revolutionary. They forced recruits to make real choices. In one exercise, they'd order a platoon to clean the entire mess hall but wouldn't tell them where the supplies were or how that industrial-sized dishwasher worked. The drill instructors would just stand there, stone-faced and silent. The recruits had to figure everything out themselves. They had to decide, plan, and execute. Inevitably, mistakes happened. One squad once used so much dish soap, they created a bubble avalanche that flooded the entire kitchen. But that wasn't the point. The point was giving them a genuine feeling of control. This reveals the first secret of productivity. Motivation gets triggered when we make choices that prove to ourselves we're in the driver's seat. Scientists call this developing an internal locus of control, which is a fancy way of saying you believe you have real authority over your actions in your world. When you genuinely feel in charge, even in small ways, your brain releases a little chemical cocktail of excitement. That's the spark plug of motivation firing. Struggling with a mountain of emails? Don't robotically start from the top. Pick one from the middle, or grab the one that looks most interesting. Make it your choice. Trying to write that dreaded essay? Skip the introduction. Start with your conclusion, or dive into whichever paragraph excites you most. By making even tiny decisions, you're broadcasting a signal to your brain, I'm running this show. But there's a second piece to this motivation puzzle. The Marines also taught recruits to constantly ask each other, why? Right in the middle of a miserable, leg-burning hike, one Marine would turn to another and ask, why are you doing this? And the answer had to be meaningful. To build a better future for my family. To become someone my daughter will be proud of. They were connecting a painful task to something deeper. That's the second half of the motivation equation. Self-motivation becomes easiest when we link our choices to our core values and biggest goals. Suddenly, a task isn't just a task anymore. It's a stepping stone towards something you genuinely care about. Answering that tedious email isn't about inbox zero. It's about being the reliable teammate you pride yourself on being. Slogging through that calculus homework isn't just about the grade. It's moving you closer to getting into your dream college. So when that familiar wave of procrastination hits, here's your two-step escape route. First, find any choice, no matter how small, that gives you a sense of control. Second, pause for just a moment and ask yourself why this seemingly boring task actually connects to your bigger life goals. Transform the chore into a meaningful decision, and motivation almost magically appears. Of course, motivation is just the ignition. Once you've got that engine running, where exactly are you headed? You need a destination. You need goals. But as Duhigg uncovered, the way most of us set goals is fundamentally, tragically broken. He tells the story of General Electric back in the 1980s. GE was an absolute industrial powerhouse, and they became obsessed with a goal-setting framework that would eventually dominate corporate America: SMART goals. You've definitely heard of these. Every goal must be specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. And honestly, it worked brilliantly, forcing people to break down their fuzzy ambitions into concrete, manageable action steps was incredibly powerful. But GE started noticing something bizarre. Some of their factories, despite being filled with workers religiously setting perfect SMART goals, were absolutely failing. When consultants investigated, they discovered people crafting beautifully detailed, perfectly realistic goals for completely trivial nonsense. One administrative assistant had a SMART goal for ordering paper clips. a security team developed a smart goal for building a new fence around the parking lot. Everyone was so addicted to that dopamine hit of checking boxes that they'd completely lost sight of what actually mattered. They were frantically busy, but heartbreakingly unproductive. This exposes a sneaky psychological trap. Our brains are absolutely addicted to closure. We love the feeling of finishing something, anything at all. And smart goals can feed that addiction like candy. We end up spending entire days knocking out easy, meaningless tasks just to feel that little rush of completion, while our most important, life-changing ambitions sit neglected in the corner gathering dust. The solution, according to GE's legendary boss Jack Welch, came from an unlikely source, Japan's bullet train. Back in the 1950s, Japanese engineers were tasked with building a faster train. They came back with designs that were marginally better than existing trains. The head of the railway rejected them outright. "Not good enough," he said. "I want a train that goes twice as fast." The engineers protested that it was physically impossible. The tracks couldn't handle those speeds. Mountains blocked the routes. "Then build new tracks," he said calmly. "Dig tunnels straight through the mountains." He gave them what Duhigg calls a stretch goal, an ambition so massive and audacious that it forces you to completely reinvent your approach. To achieve the impossible, the engineers couldn't just tweak the old system, they had to dream up something entirely new. And here's the second secret of productivity. To achieve genuinely great things, you need to marry a huge ambition with a concrete plan. You need both a stretch goal and a smart goal working together. Here's how to make this work for you. Start with your wildest, most audacious ambition. The one that makes your stomach flip when you say it out loud. Write it at the very top of a blank page. Maybe it's launch my own business, or run a marathon, or score a perfect 1600 on my SATs. That's your stretch goal. It's your North Star, your guiding light. Then, directly underneath it, break it down ruthlessly. What is the absolute first, tiniest, most specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound step you can take? If you want to run a marathon, your SMART goal might be, this week, I will run for 20 minutes on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. The stretch goal provides the meaning and the fire. It answers, why am I doing this? The SMART goal provides the map. It answers, what do I actually do next? When you combine them, you create an incredibly powerful system that prevents you from getting lost in either direction. You won't freeze up from the overwhelming size of your dream, and you won't get distracted by the shallow thrill of completing tiny, pointless tasks. You'll actually be making real, measurable progress on the things that genuinely matter. So now you're motivated, and you've got a solid system for setting meaningful goals. But here's the thing, we rarely work in isolation. We're constantly part of teams, in school, on sports fields, at work, in our families. And what Duhigg discovered is that the secrets to building a great team have absolutely nothing to do with conventional wisdom. He takes us behind the scenes at Google, a company that worships data above all else. Google wanted to engineer the perfect team, so they launched a massive research initiative called Project Aristotle. They analyzed absolutely everything. Were the best teams made up of introverts or extroverts? Did teammates need to socialize outside work? Should teams have strong leaders or flat hierarchies? For years, they crunched mountains of numbers, and they found precisely nothing. Zero patterns. The who on the team appeared completely irrelevant. Some outstanding teams were best friends outside work. Others were virtual strangers. Some had commanding managers, others didn't. They were ready to abandon the whole project. Then someone had a breakthrough. Instead of looking at who was on the team, they started examining how the team actually behaved together. They studied the unwritten rules, the subtle social norms. And suddenly, clear patterns jumped out. The best teams, the ones that consistently outperformed everyone else, shared two very specific behaviors. First, on the best teams, Everyone spoke roughly the same amount. It didn't mean everyone talked in every single meeting, but over the course of a day or week, the conversation balanced out. No single person dominated discussions, and nobody stayed perpetually silent. Everyone's voice mattered. Second, members of the best teams scored high on what researchers call average social sensitivity. That's academic speak for being good at reading emotions based on tone of voice, facial expressions, and body language. They noticed when someone felt upset or excluded. They genuinely cared about how teammates were feeling. These two behaviors created something powerful that Harvard professor Amy Edmondson calls psychological safety. Psychological safety means everyone shares a belief that the team is a safe space for taking interpersonal risks. It's the feeling that you can speak up with a wild idea, admit you screwed up, or ask what might seem like a dumb question without fear of being mocked or punished. This is the third secret of productivity. The best teams aren't the ones packed with superstars. They're the ones with the highest psychological safety. To hammer this home, Duhigg takes us backstage at Saturday Night Live in its early, legendary years. You'd imagine the original cast, John Belushi, Gilda Radner, Dan Aykroyd, was like a tight-knit family. But behind the scenes, total chaos. They were viciously competitive, intensely jealous, and argued constantly. They definitely weren't friends. So why were they so mind-blowingly brilliant together? Because their leader, Lorne Michaels, obsessively cultivated psychological safety. He made absolutely certain that everyone, even the quietest staff writer, got opportunities to pitch their ideas. He was remarkably tuned in to people's emotions, instinctively knowing when to push hard and when to offer reassurance. They fought like cats and dogs, but everyone felt safe enough to take massive creative risks. They could be brutally honest in their critiques, but somehow everyone understood it wasn't personal. It was all about making the show better. They trusted each other enough to be ruthlessly honest. To build psychological safety in your own team, whether it's a school project or a neighborhood basketball squad, you don't need to force everyone into fake friendships. You just need to model two things consistently. Make sure everyone gets genuine opportunities to contribute, and actively demonstrate that you're paying attention to how people feel. If you're leading, resist the urge to interrupt. Summarize what people say to prove you're really listening. Encourage people to voice their frustrations openly. When a team feels genuinely safe, it becomes smarter than its smartest individual member. Building this kind of trust connects directly to another powerful concept: how to manage people effectively. Duhigg takes us to a General Motors factory in Fremont, California, during the 1980s. By every measure, it was literally the worst auto plant on planet Earth. Workers drank alcohol on the job, deliberately sabotaged cars rolling down the line, and couldn't have cared less about quality. The plant was essentially a war zone between management and the union. GM eventually gave up completely and shut it down. A few years later, Toyota partnered with GM to reopen the exact same plant with the exact same terrible workers. They called it NUMMI. The Toyota executives did something radical. They flew these cynical, battle-hardened American auto workers all the way to Japan to witness the Toyota production system firsthand. One worker, Rick Madrid, watched a line worker in Japan misthread a bolt, a simple, tiny mistake. At the old GM plant, that worker would have just ignored it. The iron rule was, the line never, ever stops. But in Japan, the worker calmly reached up and pulled a rope called an andon cord. A light flashed yellow, and moments later, the entire assembly line ground to a complete halt. Madrid was absolutely stunned. He'd once seen a colleague have a literal heart attack and fall into the assembly pit, and they didn't even pause the line. But here, they stopped everything for one misthreaded bolt. A manager sprinted over, not to scream, but to help fix the problem. The lowest-ranking worker on the floor was suddenly giving orders to his boss. This was the beating heart of Toyota's philosophy, which would eventually become known as lean manufacturing. The fourth secret of productivity is to push decision-making authority down to the people closest to the actual problem. Toyota genuinely trusted their workers. They gave them the power to stop a multi-million-dollar factory because they believed the person installing that bolt knows more about that specific job than anyone in a fancy office. This created what sociologists call a commitment culture. When those American workers returned to California, they were completely transformed. They knew management actually trusted them, so they committed their hearts to the company's success. Within a single year, the absolute worst auto plant in America, staffed with the exact same workers, became one of the most productive plants anywhere in the world. This philosophy has since spread everywhere. In software development, it's called agile programming. At the FBI, it helped rescue their catastrophically failing computer system, Sentinel, by empowering junior agents and programmers to make real decisions without waiting for approval from 12 layers of bureaucracy. When you give people genuine authority and demonstrate you're committed to their success, they become more motivated, more innovative, and far more responsible. Now let's jump back into that cockpit. You're motivated, you've got clear goals, your team trusts each other completely. But then a crisis explodes. Alarms are screaming. The completely unexpected just smacked you in the face. What do you actually do? This brings us right back to Air France Flight 447. The pilots were utterly overwhelmed. Their brains entered a dangerous state called cognitive tunneling. This is what happens when your attention violently snaps from relaxed cruise control to absolute panic mode. Your brain's emergency instinct is to shine its spotlight on the most obvious thing directly in front of you, even if that thing is completely wrong. Pilot Bonin fixated on a small icon on his screen that looked slightly crooked. He became obsessed with leveling it out, completely ignoring the blaring stall warnings and the obvious fact that he was pulling the plane's nose up into a fatal climb. His co-pilot was tunneling too, staring hypnotically at a screen of scrolling computer messages, reading them aloud like a news anchor instead of looking at the actual flight instruments or noticing what his partner was doing wrong. They had all the information they needed, they just had no idea where to look. Now contrast this with another flight, Qantas 32. A year after the Air France tragedy, another Airbus, this one commanded by Captain Richard de Crespigny, suffered a catastrophic engine explosion right after takeoff from Singapore. It was legitimately one of the worst mid-air mechanical disasters in modern aviation history. Hundreds of alarms shrieked simultaneously. 21 of the plane's 22 major systems were damaged or destroyed. But Captain de Crespigny and his crew stayed remarkably calm. They landed that crippled beast safely, and all 469 people on board walked away. How on earth? The difference reveals the fifth secret of productivity. The best way to maintain focus during chaos is to build mental models, to actively tell yourself stories about what you expect to see before it happens. Before every single flight, Captain de Crespigny would walk his crew through potential disasters, like a rehearsal. Imagine there's an engine failure right after takeoff, he'd say. Where's the very first place you'll look? He was forcing them to construct mental models, to create detailed stories in their minds about possible futures. When the actual disaster struck, their brains weren't ambushed by surprise. They already had a story framework to follow. They knew exactly where to direct their precious attention. When the computer started vomiting out hundreds of contradictory instructions, de Crespigny did something brilliant. He announced, "Let's stop obsessing over what's broken and start focusing on what's still working." He consciously decided to reframe the entire situation. He told himself, "What if I imagine this massive broken Airbus is just a simple little Cessna? What would I do then?" That new story, that simplified mental model, allowed him to filter out all the screaming noise and focus only on absolute basics. Fuel, flight controls, landing gear. It transformed incomprehensible chaos into a solvable problem. We can absolutely use this in everyday life. Before you walk into a big presentation or tough conversation, tell yourself a detailed story about how you expect it to unfold. What key points will you make? What questions will your boss probably ask? What objections will your colleagues likely raise? By creating that mental model beforehand, you're preparing your brain to focus on what truly matters when curveballs inevitably get thrown. You're no longer just blindly reacting. You're directing your attention with clear intention. This ability to think systematically about the future is also the foundation of our sixth secret: how to make genuinely better decisions. Duhigg introduces us to Annie Duke, a former PhD student in cognitive psychology who became one of the best poker players in the entire world. For Annie, poker wasn't gambling at all. It was a living laboratory for studying decision-making under massive uncertainty. The secret she learned from her brother, another poker legend, was that amateur players constantly search for certainty. They desperately want to know if they have the winning hand right now. Professional players think completely differently. Great decision-makers get genuinely comfortable with uncertainty. They practice something called probabilistic thinking. They don't see the future as a single predetermined outcome. They see it as a spectrum of possibilities, each with different odds of actually happening. This is rooted in Bayesian psychology. It's the idea that even with very limited information, we can make reasonable predictions by starting with an initial educated guess, a base rate, and then constantly updating it as new information arrives. For example, when Annie sits down at a table with a completely new player, she starts with stereotypes as her baseline. Young kid wearing a poker t-shirt? Probably learned online. Likely plays conservatively. Middle-aged businessman? Probably here for entertainment. Will take bigger risks. These are her starting assumptions. But she never gets stuck there. With every single hand, she updates her internal model. If that businessman plays surprisingly conservatively, she adjusts her prediction immediately. She's constantly asking herself, what does this new piece of evidence tell me about what might happen next? The key to making better decisions is training yourself to think exactly this way. When you face an important choice, don't just fixate on the one outcome you're desperately hoping for. Force yourself to actively envision multiple different futures. What are all the plausible ways this situation could unfold? Then honestly ask yourself, what are the realistic odds of each scenario? And how do you get better at estimating those odds accurately? By deliberately exposing yourself to a much wider range of experiences, especially failures. Successful people tend to study other successes. But the wisest decision-makers, Duhigg argues, are genuinely obsessed with studying failure. They actively seek out friends who got fired to hear their stories. They read case studies about companies that went spectacularly bankrupt. They ruthlessly analyze their own past mistakes. Why? Because failures give you a far more realistic base rate for your predictions. They ground your thinking in harsh reality, not just wishful optimism. Making a good decision isn't about magically finding the single right answer. It's about accurately calculating the realistic odds and choosing the path most likely to lead to success over the long run, even when it feels uncertain and uncomfortable in the moment. So what happens when the challenge isn't just making a smart decision, but actually creating something entirely new? How do you genuinely innovate, especially when the clock is ticking and pressure is crushing? This brings us to the seventh secret of productivity, beautifully illustrated by the story of Disney's Frozen. 18 months before its scheduled release date, Frozen was an absolute disaster. In the original version, Elsa was a one-dimensional, bitter villain. Anna was an uptight, boring hero. The story had zero emotional heart, and the filmmakers knew they were in deep trouble. They were drowning in what psychologists call creative desperation. The breakthrough came when they stopped frantically trying to invent something totally original and started practicing what sociologists call innovation brokerage. This is the art of grabbing old, proven ideas from completely different worlds and smashing them together in fresh combinations. Creativity, Duhigg argues persuasively, isn't about magical lightning bolts of genius. It's about connecting unexpected dots. The most creative people function like intellectual matchmakers. They have deliberately wide-ranging experiences and can suddenly see how an idea from one field could solve a stubborn problem in another. To rescue Frozen from disaster, the team started looking inward, brokering ideas from their own messy lives. Jennifer Lee, the screenwriter, opened up about her complicated, sometimes painful relationship with her own sister. The songwriters Kristen Anderson Lopez and Bobby Lopez were walking anxiously through a park, stressed and stuck, when they asked themselves, what would it actually feel like to be Elsa emotionally? Kristen, a working mother constantly juggling impossible demands, intimately knew what it felt like to be judged for not being perfect. She channeled that deep feeling of frustration, mixed with liberation, directly into a song. It started with a traditional fairy tale melody, and then exploded into a powerful, defiant pop anthem. That song was Let It Go. When the team first heard it, they immediately knew they'd discovered the beating heart of their movie. But this song didn't fit at all with the villain Elsa they'd been writing. This was the anthem of someone misunderstood and scared, someone finally embracing her true self. Let It Go was so emotionally powerful that it forced them to completely rewrite the entire movie around it. Elsa suddenly wasn't the villain anymore. She was a hero struggling with fear and self-acceptance. The whole movie transformed into a story about love conquering fear. The lesson here is that we all have massive wells of creative material already inside us, our own experiences, emotions, frustrations, and fears. To truly innovate, we need to become brokers of our own lives. Pay close attention to how different things make you feel. That's how you discover the emotional truth that separates boring clichés from genuine insights. And don't be terrified of that panicky feeling when you're completely stuck. Creative desperation is often exactly the spark that forces us to connect old ideas and break through new ways. But there's one final piece of this puzzle. In our modern world, we're absolutely drowning in information. We have data on literally everything. So how do we transform all that overwhelming noise into actual usable knowledge? This is the eighth and final secret, and Duhigg illustrates it perfectly with the story of a failing school in Cincinnati called South Avondale. The school had access to all the data in the world. Administrators had fancy online dashboards tracking every single student's attendance, test scores, and homework completion. But the school was still classified as being in academic emergency by the state. Teachers were so completely overwhelmed by the constant flood of spreadsheets and reports that they just ignored them entirely. They were suffering from classic information blindness. The district decided to try something that seemed completely insane. They created a physical data room, and they forced teachers to do something that appeared incredibly inefficient and backwards. They had to take all that sleek digital data and manually transcribe it by hand onto old-fashioned index cards. They had to draw simple graphs on cheap butcher paper with markers and tape them up on the walls. They deliberately made the information disfluent. Disfluency means intentionally making something harder to process quickly. And here's the paradox. When information is slightly harder to absorb, we actually learn it far more deeply. When you take notes by hand instead of typing on a laptop, you physically can't write down every single word. You're forced to actively listen, mentally process, and intelligently summarize. You're actually doing something with the information. That small amount of extra labor forces genuine engagement with the material, and you remember it dramatically better. That's exactly what happened in Cincinnati's data room. As teachers physically handled those index cards, sorting them into piles based on which students struggled with similar specific problems, they started seeing patterns they'd never noticed in all those digital spreadsheets. They weren't passively receiving data anymore. They were actively interacting with it, manipulating it, wrestling with it. They were transforming raw information into actionable knowledge. They realized a group of students in one classroom was great at pronouns but terrible at fractions, while a class right next door had exactly the opposite problem. So the teachers simply traded lesson plans. Scores climbed. They noticed that students living in the same neighborhood were all struggling with identical reading assignments, so they started assigning homework they could tackle together on the bus ride home. Scores jumped again. By making their data harder and slower to work with, they paradoxically made it infinitely more useful. The final secret of productivity is this: to genuinely learn anything, we absolutely have to do something active with our data. When you encounter a fascinating new idea, don't just passively read it and move on. Stop and explain it out loud to a friend. When you're tracking your spending habits, don't just glance at the app. Write those numbers down by hand and force yourself to ask what patterns they reveal. Every choice we make is essentially an experiment, and every experience is a valuable piece of data. The trick is forcing ourselves to actively engage with it, to mentally manipulate it, to turn it over in our minds, until it becomes a natural part of how we see and understand the world. When you step back and look at these 8 secrets in Smarter, Faster, Better with fresh eyes, a single powerful truth comes into sharp focus. Productivity isn't a clever hack or shortcut. It's absolutely not about discovering the perfect app or following some magical morning routine. It's a learnable skill, deeply rooted in a very human hunger for meaning and control in what we do with our days. What Charles Duhigg has generously given us is a completely new vocabulary for thinking about our own work and lives with clarity. He shows us that the overwhelming feeling of being constantly busy but somehow ineffective isn't a personal failing or character flaw. It's almost always the result of choices we don't even realize we're making moment to moment. We let our motivation slowly drift away because we forget to assert our control. We set fuzzy, vague goals because we're secretly afraid of the brutal clarity that a real, specific plan demands of us. We work in teams that accidentally stifle brilliant ideas because nobody's learned how to build genuine psychological safety. We get hopelessly lost in distraction because we haven't taken time to tell ourselves a clear story about where our focus should actually land. The most profound lesson in this entire book, at least for me personally, is that becoming more productive is fundamentally an act of mindfulness. It requires us to consciously step back from the frantic, exhausting pace of modern life and ask ourselves deceptively simple questions. Why am I actually doing this? What do I honestly expect to happen? How does my team genuinely feel right now? What are the other realistic possibilities I'm not seeing? What can this painful failure actually teach me if I'm brave enough to look? These aren't questions about cold efficiency or grinding productivity metrics. These are profound questions about purpose and meaning, and that's precisely why this book is so much more than just another guide to cramming more tasks into your day. It's genuinely a guide to living a more deliberate, intentional, meaningful life. So how can you start applying these ideas in your actual life right now, today? Here are 3 beautifully simple actions you can take immediately. First, find a choice, any choice. The very next time you face a task you're absolutely dreading, don't just grit your teeth and dive in head first. Stop for just 10 seconds and find one small decision you can make about how you'll approach it. Where will you physically sit? What part will you tackle first? What music or silence will you choose? Reclaim even a tiny piece of control, and watch that spark of motivation flicker back to life. Second, tell yourself a story. Before your next important class, big meeting, or difficult conversation, take just 2 quiet minutes to vividly envision how you want it to unfold. What's your ideal outcome? What obstacles will likely pop up? How will you handle them when they do? By creating even a simple mental model, you're preparing your mind to focus sharply on what truly matters when things get chaotic. And third, deliberately embrace disfluency. The next time you learn something genuinely important, from a book, a lecture, a podcast like this one, don't just let the information passively wash over you like background noise. Do something active with it. Write down the key ideas in your own words. Try explaining the core concept to a friend over coffee. Find one small, concrete way to test the idea in your actual life. That small effort, of actively interacting with information is precisely what transforms it from fleeting data into lasting wisdom. That was a summary of Smarter, Faster, Better by Charles Duhigg. We've journeyed through some genuinely big ideas today, but I'll be completely honest with you. Any summary can only ever be a rough map. The real treasure, the real transformation, happens when you take the journey yourself through the actual pages. The true magic of a book like this unfolds in those quiet moments of reading, when a particular story, or even just a simple phrase, suddenly connects with your own life in a way you absolutely didn't expect. This summary is really just a starting point, designed to help you decide if this book deserves a spot in your precious reading time. If anything we've explored together has sparked even a flicker of curiosity or a genuine desire for change, I strongly encourage you to grab your own copy. Reading it isn't just about passively absorbing information. It's an experience that can genuinely transform the way you see yourself and navigate the world around you. The link to the book is waiting in the description below. Also, if you found this journey valuable and worthwhile, please take just a moment to click that like button and subscribe to the channel. It tells us we're heading in the right direction, and it makes sure you won't miss our next deep exploration into another potentially life-changing book. Let's keep learning and growing together.